Hi there, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in to my presentation. Sea marbles. They can be quite the enigma in the beachcombing world. There's some of us out there that recover them in abundance, while other people search year after year for that elusive first marble. Today I'm going to be sharing the information that I've picked up over the years pertaining to these beautiful finds in hopes to shed some insight as to why this is. In 2008, I traded in my big city life for a more meaningful existence out in Cape Breton Island, and I'd never seen or heard of sea glass before, although my encounter with it was absolutely inevitable because it just scatters the coastline all around this beautiful island. Now, 2008 was also a very rough year financially for the whole global economy, and I found myself without a nest egg out in a strange place with no source of income. I started putting my beachcombing treasures up for sale on eBay. I still remember that first round of offerings. There was 12 different listings, all for 99 cents, but only one of them got bids. It was a shooter marble, and it ended up selling for $36. This was the first inclination that I had that the spot that I'm picking is very unique and different than on most of the other places out there, was these sea marbles that I was finding that were highly coveted. Over time, I had these days where I was picking massive amounts of sea marbles. I remember one particular weekend in 2009, I recovered 75 sea marbles in one weekend, and a lot of them were very small. We're talking 6 to 5 millimeters, which I came to learn that these tiny marbles are even more sought than the larger ones that you can see over here in my hand. Now, as I continue to journey around Cape Breton Island and explore my new home and find new beachcombing beaches, I came to realize that while there is sea glass all over the place, not every single spot has the marble abundance that I was finding a few hundred feet from my new home. And I wondered to myself why it was that these marbles were so localized just to where I lived and not other places. Now, the first theory that was put forth to me that these were toys that were left on the beach by children in generations past. Now, I have to say that over the years, I've recovered everything from small army men to large Barbie figures to even a Wayne Gretzky figure, which I know is very modern out on my beaches. But I don't think that this would have been what produced such an abundance of marbles out my way. A few years later, I was working in the yard with one of my older neighbors. He was actually in his 90s, and he was talking to me about how he sees me going to the beach all the time, and that was the spot that everybody used to hang out when he was a kid. And he also said that all of the kids carried slingshots, and they would take the marbles, and they would use the marbles for slingshot ammunition. The idea of using marbles such as these as slingshot ammunition just seemed absolutely absurd to me. These are glassy marbles that would really hurt someone. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be hit by one of these at high velocity. Then a few years later, I wanted to know more about my marbles, so I joined some collectors guilds online on Facebook. After reading the comments of so many experts on these marble groups referring to common mid-century marbles as slingshot ammunition, it became apparent to me that what my neighbor was saying was true, that some of the marbles that I was finding on my beach may absolutely have been introduced by slingshot ammunition. For the longest period of time, this slingshot ammunition theory was the best explanation I had as to why I had an abundance of sea marbles out on my beach, and I wasn't finding them in all the other spots around Cape Breton. It wasn't until I had children until that aha moment occurred to me, and I knew exactly what made my area so unique and so different, and why these marbles were in just such an abundance. Now, I'm sure a lot of parents out there, especially if you are parents to two young boys who love to explore their curiosities like me, have realized that there's a time period in a kid's life where they're absolutely fascinated with the toilet and how it just makes things disappear. So after watching my children attempting to flush so many different things down the toilet, it actually occurred to me that this is absolutely the most viable explanation as to why there is such an abundance of marbles out my way. So let's just take one kid who has one bag of marbles and he flushes it down the toilet. That might introduce 200, 300, even 500 marbles onto a particular beach where the drain pipes empty out nearby. Now let's hypothesize that over a 10-year period, one kid every single year is flushing a collection of marbles down the beach. Now this would absolutely create the extreme abundance of marbles, the phenomenon that I've experienced out my way and that a few other people have experienced as well. Allow me to share this story with you. For over a decade, decade now, I've been blessed to beachcomb professionally and share the insight that I've acquired studying glass history with friends from around the world who share their finds with me, hoping to have a little bit more information to enhance the beachcombing experience. Now, I had this one particular picker come to me, and she was finding a massive abundance of marbles on an island in the middle of a wide river. What was really strange about this was that she wasn't finding any sea glass whatsoever. The only thing that she was finding was these marbles, and she had to reach this island using a kayak. Now, upon studying a lot of these marbles, they all seem to be from the same era. They seem to be from about 1930 to 1940, and it stopped right there. She was actually really concerned that the glass and the marbles were seeded, even though it was a small little island with no population around it whatsoever. So she asked me to look at them, and she asked my honest opinion as to whether or not these marbles were seeded. You know, I took a really good look at these marbles, and there was no way in my mind that I thought that they were seeded. And then we did a bunch of research together, and lo and behold, we actually discovered that the old drain pipes from the town that wasn't nearby emptied into the river, and then the river flowed straight towards where her island was. So this to me was a perfect explanation as to why she was finding these amazing marbles in this one particular spot, but not a single ounce of sea glass was recovered out her way. And when this story was shared to me, this is when I absolutely unequivocally said to myself that I know how come my sea marbles are so abundant and they're so rare in contrast to everybody else. It's because they were introduced mostly through the old drain sewers. Well, our understanding of the environment and our views definitely have changed a lot over the last century. The truth of the matter is, if you live in a maritime town that's next to the ocean, such as mine, there's a really good chance that the drain pipes emptied out into the ocean for the longest period of time. And what that means is that anything else that got flushed down a toilet or washed down a sink as well would have ended up out in the ocean. And then subsequently, as these pipes usually didn't extend too far out into the ocean, they would get washed back up very easily with the ebb and flow of the waves. There are two very different types of beaches that we recover sea glass on. The first one is a beach where the glass originates from a rubbish tip or a rubbish cove, which means that there was a designated area in that spot where people brought their discards to and threw it into the ocean. Now, the second type of beach that produces sea glass is a public beach, or what I also refer to as a party beach. Now, I'm going to be discussing Bonfire Glass because to me, this is one of the best indicators as to what type of a beach that we're hanging out on and finding our sea glass. Now, I know what you might be thinking. There was definitely bonfires on public beaches, and there was bonfires in the rubbish tips as well because they burned so much of the discards that they could. So it's really hard to tell if you find a bottle like this whether or not it originated from a rubbish tip or whether or not there was a bunch of people having some beers by a bonfire and they threw this one in. So when it comes to the bonfire glass, the biggest indicator to me is when you start to find colors that aren't these 20th century colors. In my town, on the beach below the old rubbish tip, I've recovered a rainbow of bonfire sea glass out my way. You can see right over here in my hand, I've got a piece of red, yellow, and cobalt blue. I've even recovered some uranium bonfire glass as well. Now, these are not colors that we would expect to see consumer beverages in, so we know without a doubt that if we're finding colors such as this and other ones that are rare and we know that weren't used for beverage bottles, that we are absolutely picking on a beach that's fed by a rubbish cove as opposed to a party beach. Now, this kind of invokes the wow factor for me. When you know that you're picking on a rubbish tip, you can almost find anything because people would have discarded virtually anything back then. And I typically find that when I go to a public beach, there is quite the abundance of sea glass on it because there were so many consumer bottles that went into the ocean. However, you just aren't going to find too many bright and rare colors that you would because you're kind of limited to just what people would have consumed and left behind. I really wanted to talk about what it means when you're finding pieces of old glass washboards out your way. You know, a lot of people would look at this right over here and see this as a beautiful antique. But to me, this is a symbol of how good we have it here in North America with running water and electricity when you consider the fact that there's over 5 billion people on the planet to this day that still rely on some form of a washboard to get their laundry chores done. You know, in 1940, there was over 60% of the population in the United States actually had an electric machine. So that got me into wondering what happened to all of these washboards. You know, some of them would have been put into the basement or the attic, but the truth is that most of them were thrown away. And that's where the sea glass shard comes into play. Because if you find a piece of glass washboard on your favorite beach, there's a good chance you're not just finding one, there's a good chance you're finding a lot of them. When you factor in that so many people would have been throwing away their old glass washboards around that time period, it's easy to understand why some people find an abundance and others don't find any of them. What this means is that your specific beach that you like to pick was actually used for discarding well into the middle part of the 20th century, and there was no actual rubbish pickup in that area. And that's really a wild indication to think that in only about 70 years ago, people were still throwing their garbage liberally into the ocean, and they didn't have any regard for nature. Thanks for sharing your time with me, everybody, and watching my presentation. I really hope that you found this video insightful. I also want to give a very special thanks to the committee at the Mermaids Tier Sea Glass Festival for letting me take part once again in this year's activities.